Today I'm going to show you how to can tomatoes. The first step is to wash your tomatoes in cold water. Any dirt on your tomatoes could end up getting into your finished product, so you want to make sure they're nice and clean. I'm actually doing this the night before because canning tomatoes can be a pretty lengthy process. So I'm going to do anything that I can to make tomorrow go as smooth as possible. This year I have almost 100 pounds of tomatoes, and you can use pretty much any tomato that you'd like. The most popular tomato type for the style of canning that I'm doing today would be any type of plum tomato because it has less water inside and is mostly flesh, and you'll see that when I cut them open tomorrow. The next step is to cut up our tomatoes, and you want to remove any of the bad parts, and you also want to remove the cores of the tomato. Once you've done that, you can cut them into smaller chunks and set them aside. Here you can see why plum tomatoes are more desirable for canning, because compared to a traditional tomato, they have a lot more flesh and a lot less of this jelly stuff. From this point, you have a couple of options. Option one is to put them in a strainer, sprinkle them with some salt, put the strainer over a baking tray, and any excess water will drain out from the tomatoes. And then from that point, you can pre-cook them to soften them up a little bit. But for today, we're going to take these and send them right into the tomato press. If you don't have a tomato press, stick around until the end of the video and I'll show you how you can do it by hand. The reason why you might want to pick option one is because it cuts down on the cooking time for your tomatoes, but because I have almost 100 pounds of tomatoes, I need to go as quick as I can today. Okay, I moved this part of the operation downstairs because people are still sleeping in my house, so we're going to fill up the hopper and run the tomatoes through the press. It would help if I plugged it in. So all of your tomato puree will come out here, and all of the skin and seeds will come out here. Okay, I finished pressing my tomatoes and I got about 3 big pots full. We'll get to that in a second. All of the skins and seeds, they can actually be pressed multiple times to get more tomato out. Unfortunately, with this Weston machine, the motor isn't strong enough to handle that, so I'm not able to press them again. I've tried it before and it jammed up the machine and started shredding the seeds, and then they ended up in the sauce, and that was no good. So if you have a stronger machine, you can press these again, but in our case, we're just going to skip that because the machine can't handle it. One other thing I wanted to mention is when you're choosing a pot, be sure to use either coated or stainless. If you use raw aluminum, it could cause a reaction with the tomatoes, so it's best to use these types. We're going to cook this on about a medium heat until it reduces to about half of the volume that we have in the pot. It could take 2, 4, 6 hours. It really depends on how much water were in your tomatoes, but just keep cooking them until they reduce by about half. You also want to make sure that you are frequently stirring your pots, because as the sauce thickens and the water is drawn out, the tomatoes have a tendency to start to burn and stick to the pan. So stir them every couple minutes so that they don't stick to the pot. Here you can see how much the volume has dropped after several hours of cooking. To prepare my jars, I'm putting them in the dishwasher, and I'm going to use added heat and heated dry so that when I'm ready to fill them, they're already warm, so the glasses won't shatter from the temperature shock of putting the hot tomatoes into the jars. If you're going to be hand washing your jars because you have a smaller amount of tomatoes, you can heat them up before putting your tomatoes in by putting them in your canner rack and leaving it up while the water heats up. This way, when you're ready to fill your jars, they'll be warm and they won't shatter. To wash the lids, I clean them with hot soapy water and then rinse them off completely. I do the same thing for the rings. The next thing I do is take a clean jar and put a half a teaspoon of citric acid in it. If you don't have citric acid, you could also use 2 tablespoons of lemon juice. And the reason that you do this is it helps lower the pH to make it safe for water bath canning. After that, fill the jar with your tomatoes and leave a ½ inch of space from the top of the jar. Once that's done, wipe the rim of the jar to make sure it's clean so it forms a nice seal. Finally, add a lid and a band to your jar and screw it fingertip tight. Then you can put it in your canner. If you have hard water, you can add a splash of vinegar to your canner to try to reduce the amount of mineral buildup on your jars. When you're filling your canner, make sure that the water level is at least an inch or 2 above the top of the jars, and then set it to boil. Once your canner is at a full boil, you can put the lid on it and set a timer for 40 minutes. After 40 minutes are up, shut the heat off and let the canner cool for 5 to 10 minutes. After that time, you can carefully remove the jars out of your canner and let them cool for 12 to 24 hours. To check the quality of your seals, you can push on the lid to see if it flexes or is loose. If your seals look good, you can take off the rings and put them in long-term storage. Here you can see the difference that adding vinegar to your canner can make. On the canner that I didn't add vinegar, there was a lot of mineral buildup, but on the other one, the jars were really clean. Here I had some jars that didn't seal properly. As you can see, the lids didn't soften up, so no seal was formed. You can dump these out and reheat them, reheat the jars, and then process them again. But for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to take out a little bit, so there's about 1 inch to 1.5 inches of space from the top of the jar. Put new lids on and then stick them in the freezer. Okay, so back to the question of how do I do this if I don't have a machine? And it basically comes down to you have to peel and press the tomatoes by hand. There's a couple different ways you can peel tomatoes by hand. One way is to blanch them, so bring a pot of water up to a boil, put in your tomatoes, and when the skin cracks, take it out and put it in cold water. After it cools down, the skin will peel right off. Another way is to cut the core out of the tomato, put it on a baking sheet, and roast it in the oven for a couple minutes. A third option is to place all of your tomatoes in a freezer, wait until they're frozen, and then as they thaw, once you take them out, the skin will just come right off. Once your tomatoes are peeled, you can then cut them and core them if you need to, and then you have to press them by hand. To press them by hand, you do still need some equipment, but it's much cheaper than having a full-on machine. If you've seen my applesauce video, you know this tool. This is a food mill, and you can use this to make your tomato puree. These food mills usually come with different size screens. You want to use the one that has the smallest holes so that the seeds don't pass through it. It's also a good idea to heat your tomatoes up before putting them in a hand-powered food mill because it's going to make them a lot easier to go through. So after you warm up your tomatoes a little bit, you would just put them in the top and you crank this and it presses everything out the bottom and keeps the skin and the seeds in the top. One thing to keep in mind is if you're doing a lot of tomatoes, you're going to have to empty the top part of the food mill, remove the skins and seeds every now and then, just to make room for more. Using a hand-powered food mill does increase the amount of time it's going to take, so grab a friend and have them help you out. With that being said, I hope you liked this video. If you have a question, feel free to leave a comment, hit that like button if you enjoyed, and get subscribed to see what I have coming up next. As always, thanks for watching, and happy canning.